Well, welcome everyone to the History Consortium's Historic Railroads Week. So nice to have all of you with us tonight. This is our second program, but this is our very first educational program for the History Consortium. We are a group that has been in existence for less than a year, made up of several history organizations dedicated to providing providing education on local history. And before we start tonight's program, I want to remind you that we have another excellent program tomorrow night on Franklin County's furnaces and the railroads. But tonight, we've got a great program for you. Rails to York, sponsored by the York County History Center. And so I'm going to turn it all over to our good friend Christine from the York County History Center. So Christine, it's all yours.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York County History Center's evening program with the History Consortium. Today's program is called Ticket to Opportunity, and it's about how the railroad influenced the lives of York's African-American community. From William Wood, one of Lebanon's residents and a noted machinist for Phineas Davis, who actually built a steam engine here in York, to the many jobs the railroad created, laborers, Pullman Porters, etc., and the many families that migrated from the South and settled to York as part of the Great Migration. Our speaker today is Tina Charles. By day, she has been a medical records professional for over 25 years. Her hobby of genealogy led her to becoming a contributor for Find a Grave and Billion Graves, and also led her to the many African-American cemeteries throughout York County, documenting her children's history on their father's side. Her research at Lebanon Cemetery in North York developed into forming the nonprofit Friends of Lebanon Cemetery, where they research, document, restore, preserve, and educate on the history of families interred within. So I'm going to turn the time over to Tina and let her get started with her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tina Charles, as I was just introduced. I first want to state off by saying that although this is mainly about how the railroad played its part in the Great Migration, I also want to state that in order to get there, we're going to have to go back a little bit. So we're going to start basically at the beginning and show basically how all of the events that occurred have ties to the railroad for the African-American community, especially in York. So if we go to our first slide. So in January of 1831, the B&O Railroad published an advertisement in the newspaper that offered a premium for 2 locomotives that should come up to the specifications that they set forth. The reason that this was very remarkable was because this showed a very thorough knowledge of what a railroad engine ought to be, but the motor which the president described had not yet taken form and shape. So the object of the advertisement was to submit to mechanics of the country certain facts and principles to the end that they might be applied to the construction of an effective locomotive. So the sum of $4,000 was to be paid for first place that was constructed for the locomotive that was constructed in accordance with these specifications, and $3,500 for the second best. So there were 3 locomotives that were entered into this in pursuance of this advertisement. So this ended up being the most interesting chapter for the B&O Railroad. And so they tested the engines from June 1st, 1831 to June 27th. And the trial did not end until July 12th. But this is when Phineas Davis of York put in his first, his entry for the York. You put my slide up, yeah. Well, anyway, so so the interesting thing about the York, which ended up winning this contest, was that it was drafted by Phineas and Gardner. There we go. Is it? Okay. So it was drafted by Phineas and Gardner, but what I want to stress is that this actual engine was constructed or built by William Wood, who happens to be one of the residents at Lebanon Cemetery here in North York. William Wood was an African American who actually lived on South Newberry Street, which was right around the corner from Phineas Davis's shop. There was an article in 1907 talking about, at the York Gazette, talking about the African American race in York. And William Wood was mentioned because he was known as a master machinist for several firms in York. And he also built the first spark catcher that was attached to a steam railroad engine that was patented by Phineas Davis. But another important part, again tying to the railroad, is that he also helped escape slaves. So that moves us on to our next subject, which is going to be our next slide, William Goodridge. So William Goodridge was a prominent African-American that lived here in York. If anybody doesn't know who William Goodridge is, there is the Goodridge Freedom Center that is located on East Philadelphia Street. But he was mainly known for helping and being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. But what's not really known about William Wood, this would be my next slide, is that he actually had gotten some rail cars. I believe he had 13 rail cars that he termed as the Reliance Line birther cars. So in the aftermath of the Christiana Riot over in Lancaster County, some of the black men who had actually participated in that fight ended up making the first leg of their trip north to safety in Canada on a special freight car of Goodridge's Reliance Line. And then on top of that, not too long after that, in 1859, John Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry. His most trusted lieutenant, Osborne Perry Anderson, had actually made his way to York, where William Goodridge actually hid him in a room in one of his buildings downtown in York. But he ultimately ended up putting him on one of his cars to give him safe passage to Philadelphia, to get him out of the way. And on top of that, he also always used his cars to help many people on the Underground Railroad actually escape to freedom, whether it be to Philadelphia or further up from there to Canada. But so we know that the building of railroads across America involved thousands of African Americans. Virtually every railroad that had been built in pre-emancipation era South was built using either slave labor or freedmen. And even during the Civil War, the U.S. military railroads actually employed thousands of both freedmen but contraband slaves to help build the railroad. So that is just the very beginning place where blacks learned that they had, unlike sharecropping and domestic service, this offered a more economically independent life for them, starting by working on the railroad. Next slide. Oh, there they are. Okay. So, yes. Okay. So, next slide. So in 1865, Lincoln's funeral train came through York, and it actually arrived in York at 6:40 p.m. Scott Mingus has a book Soldiers, Spies, and Steam, A History of the Northern and Central Railway in the Civil War, where he basically detailed that the funeral train arrived in York just after dusk, and the local U.S. Army Hospital's brass band was playing a mournful dirge as uniformed local militia and invalid soldiers lined the tracks. So there were a few low booms that rattled the windows as minute guns fired a salute from a nearby hillside, and church bells solemnly tolled. Black cloth draped many buildings, and crowds of citizens ignored the chilly rain for a chance to see the train. So the sidewalks, the doors, and the windows were swarmed with people. And as the engine took on water, the crowd opened a passage for 6 ladies that were dressed in mourning black. 2 Army generals greeted Miss Isabel Small and her friends as they came forward, and the ladies somberly asked permission to place a large wreath in the funeral car. They carried a beautiful wreath that was 3 feet in diameter, that had an outer ring of white roses and inner circles alternating between the choicest red and white fragrant flowers that included camellias. And inside the wreath was a flag or shield with blue violets as the field, white violets as stars and stripes, and red geraniums for the red stripes. And symbolically, this black man quietly placed the wreath on Lincoln's coffin. So everybody was asking, who's this man that got to place the wreath on Lincoln's train? So that would be Aquila Howard, who has a crazy story of his own, but his family escaped from Maryland and came up the river until they reached Columbia. And Aquila Howard is known for, jumping off the ship and scooping up the ground and kissing it. And it was the first time his family had felt some freedom. His father had made a comment that, they could go from the north to the south with no problem on any train, but that they could not come back up on the train from the south to the north without problems. So that Aquila Howard is also interred at Lebanon Cemetery. And he's going to come back to play later in the story when we get more into the Great Migration. But basically between 1869 and 1873, again, thousands and thousands of jobs on the railroad for African Americans. There was a journalist, Jediah Hotchkiss, who wrote about Black railroad workers in 1873, quoting that they have proved, in fact, to be fine laborers, both as track makers and for mining, blasting, and all the other work of railroad building. They lived in shanties along the road, wherever their work lay. The road, was built almost entirely by the labor of Negroes, who here proved themselves admirable and trustworthy workmen, sober, equal to the severe toil, and winning the good opinion of everyone. These blacks, of whom 5,000 were employed on the road, were all formerly slaves in Eastern Virginia. So we know from doing our research at Lebanon Cemetery that we have a lot of families that were basically migrated here from Virginia and using the railroad, basically working on the railroad. After, Reconstruction was completed after the Civil War, we know that depot and rail yards and towns along the rails continued to provide jobs. There were several jobs. Next slide. One of the most popular jobs was Gandy Dancers. They would line the tracks. Always hard labor, never-ending tasks. So Gandy Dancers were the men who used songs and rhythm that was sort of seen in choreographed teams, as we used to know those railroad songs that used to come out. I know some thought they came from like the chain gangs, but it basically was started with the Gandy Dancers. So they would align the track with precision and place the heavy wooden ties in the steel rails, driving in the spikes. And then when the transcontinental railroad started in the southern states, Again, thousands of new jobs provided for grading lines, building bridges, blasting tunnels. And the firemen were the ones, who were shoveling the coal into the engines. They were loading the baggage and the freight. And sometimes, very frequently, every now and then, they would actually get to drive the trains. But these were, jobs that basically provided a new way of life for a lot of families. And you would mainly see the men working on these railroad positions, but next slide. You also would see the women. The women took on rail jobs just as frequently as the men, doing the hard labor jobs, which I did not know until I actually researched all of this. But so, the post-civil years into the 20th century, I think the most familiar job that everybody associates with African Americans is Pullman Porters. Pullman Porters were not the only service jobs, but they were the most well-known. So the cooks on the trains, and this was strange to learn, but the cooks on the trains traveling to so many different locations would actually pick up a lot of different cuisine skills depending on the area and the train line that they basically worked for. But also there were Pullman Maids, which were similar to Pullman Porters, but these were the service jobs that had regular contact with everybody on the train. And they basically served as, the valets, the bellhops, the maids, the janitors for the luxury sleeper cars. And the railroads would, advertise this on every line, but they were paid extremely low wages. And Pullman Porters had to make their money in tips from the public to survive and thrive. They worked long hours. They were routinely racially discriminated against. But management would sometimes, try to incentivize them by providing the best service, to be complicit in following orders, resisting unionization. But in the late 1920s, the Pullman Company hired the most African Americans in the United States, even though they were one of the worst exploited workers in the country. But the Pullman Porter jobs offered them, this was a different class than the regular labor jobs that we've always seen African Americans who, from building the original railroad tracks to helping build the engines to doing all the hard labor jobs, the brakemen, before there were air brakes. But they were the ones who, were separating. It was one of the most dangerous jobs they could have. But the Pullman Porters basically were considered the blue collar employment, and getting the ability to travel to so many different cities, especially the Southern men who would, be frequently traveling to Chicago or New York and the like on the trains. They would gather newspapers from all these different cities, and they would bring them back down south when they got to come home, and they would share them with their families. And that sort of inspired people from the South to want to go north. They wanted to go north and get better jobs that they were seeing because they weren't being paid well in the South. But the Pullman Porters eventually did form a union. And the funny thing was that the Pullman Porters Union was actually started by Black women. They were the ones who helped them unionize to become unions, to get their union started, which just seems totally strange. But knowing that there were Pullman Maids as well who did similar, they were the nannies on the train. They were the ones who were taking care of your children. You could frequently see them doing nails and hair, and, basically performing all the services that, a housemaid would perform on the train for these families that could afford to do that. So they were subjected pretty much to the same conditions as the Pullman Porters, but in that, they were the ones that fought more for the unionization of the field. Here in York, we had quite a few Pullman Porters. The most notable one that we have that's buried at Lebanon was Marian Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong, he was employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad for over 18 years, but he had an early death. He died when he was only 46 in 1924 and left his wife and son. But he actually, was part of the Pullman Porters relief. And he also went on, came and settled in York as a result of his travels on the train. And from that, his contribution to York, he ended up being the organizer of the local lodge of the Elks, and also served on the board of directors at the community house, and was also associated with Social Friendship Lodge, Grand United Order of Odd Fellows. He was also a singer in his choir at Zion AME Church. And his church also, we're going to talk about, as a result of the Great Migration, we had this influx of Black people coming to York, and they needed to develop societies and organizations that could help them with housing and food and entertainment. And that was one of the AME Zion Church really stepped up to that under the direction of Dr. George Bowles. They had created something called the People's Forum, but I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself. So next slide. So we're going to talk about the Great Migration as it's known, but it's basically, it was a catch-all name for this exodus of African Americans between, I'm going to say maybe around 1916 it started, all the way up through 1970. It originally started because of World War I. World War I came, and there was a huge shortage of factory workers in the North trying to keep up with the war efforts. So they would actually go ahead and publish in newspapers down south, advertising for jobs up north. And it got to the point where the Pennsylvania Railroad actually ended up offering free fare on the tickets to go north. They would coordinate with certain factories, certain companies would, say, if you, promise that when you get north, you'll come to work for us, we'll give you a free ticket to come north. Now, along the way, a lot of people would jump off the train somewhere else and find better opportunities, maybe at a different company, or some would, conveniently get lost when they did arrive to the destination. And, they would go off and find a better job at another company. Some companies actually resorted to holding their belongings hostage to try to incentivize them to stay and fulfill their contract for the fare that they gave them. And some people actually just left all their belongings go, especially if they found out that the job that they had signed up for wasn't what it had promised to be down in the advertisement down south. But some of the companies here in York that offered that was, P.H. Gladfelder. York actually had a lot of opportunity, and being so close to Baltimore, a lot of people would travel to Baltimore or maybe on their way to Philadelphia, and they would end up staying in York because York had just as much opportunity as everywhere else. A.B. Farker had farm machinery that he was building. There was York Safes, piano companies. We had so many cigar factories that were hiring. We had automobile manufacturers and the like. And the crazy thing was, that getting people to jump on the Erie Railroad, for instance, brought over 9,000 people north. The B&O transported over 10,000 or more to work at the docks, like in Baltimore or Philadelphia. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. But here in York, we saw the greatest influx of people coming from the Carolinas, South Carolina, North Carolina, a little bit from Georgia, definitely from Virginia, and we've always had a huge number of people come from Baltimore and Maryland to come north. But that started the term as the Bambergers for York. But you have to remember, the railroad wasn't always a happy symbol for Southern Blacks. They used to, it at one point was a way of ripping families apart when slavery was legal. There would be newly purchased slaves down south, once they were sold off at auction, and they would be put on trains sometimes to go to other families. And so trying to get, and then the Underground Railroad, different vision of the rail, you go from having families ripped apart to creating a way to use the railroad to reunite families and get families back together and out of bondage. But here was an actual railroad that would take, you to a better opportunity up north. But the problem and the first obstacle for a lot of the Southern families, the Southern Blacks in the railroad, was scraping enough money together to pay that fare, which could be anywhere from $15 to $20. Next one. Yeah, we'll leave it there. That's okay. It's okay. And that's why, part of the reason too, why the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to offer this free fare that were willing, for people who were willing to work on the railroad. Pennsylvania provided free transportation for over 12,000. And just to show, and I don't know if maybe it's on the next slide. No, go back. I think it was back a couple. Should be like a graph line. Okay, yeah, okay, so we're back at the graph. So this basically shows how the population of African Americans in New York doubled because of the Great Migration. It more than doubled. But the population in general of York County around 1880 was 13,940, but by 1930 had swelled to over 55,000. So that just shows you that, during those years, once the Great Migration really started and people really started, taking these jobs instead of necessarily working on the trains, but taking those jobs and, getting jobs in factories. And then they would make enough money that they were always sending that money down home. But the train also served its purpose, where these people that had come north would use the train to then go back down south to visit their family frequently and also bring more family back with them. So you have to figure that the Northern Central Railroad was the line from Baltimore that really brought the majority of the people into York. And as I said, the Gladfelder, P.H. Gladfelders, A.B. Farker, and all the farm machinery, there were so many jobs offered to them. And then you have the second wave of migration, which actually laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement, because you had, African Americans using the railroad, and they came to the north, and they had the right to vote. They had so many more opportunities and rights in the north than they did in the south. But because of that and the migration, there were so many organizations like the churches, like Bethel, and as I said, the AME Zion Church, that had to basically create these social organizations and other businesses to provide jobs, housing, healthcare, education, and the like for the new people who were arriving. In March of 1916 here, Dr. Bowles organized a committee of persons, and they ended up having this mass meeting and formed a local chapter here in York for the NAACP. And him, along with Dr. Bowles and Reverend Thomas Montooth, were also instrumental in procuring what they called the Community House for Colored People on North Duke Street. And it had things, like a reception room, a reading room, a small gym. And that was actually under Faith Presbyterian Church and became a model for what we now have today, which is the Crispus Attucks Community Center. They had Bible study classes, domestic science, art classes, boys and girls clubs. The Emergency Girls Club was formed around, and I think I wrote it, 1922 by Ida Grayson and Helen Thaxton. And that catered more to the women and to the girls to give them religious and educational opportunities. So some of the families, next slide. Some of the families, next one, that came north, specifically known as the Bambergers. So we had David Orr. David Orr was from Bamberg County in South Carolina, and he had started out with a job on the railroad. He ultimately came north. He only had an 8th grade education, but he worked and saved money and ended up owning a refuse or trash company here in York. But he had started out selling pancake syrup door to door. But during one of his trips back down home on the railroad, he met his wife, Eula May Nimmons, and they moved to York, came back up to York in 1928, where they settled. But he originally, as I said, held many different jobs, working 2, 3, 4 jobs, selling pancake syrup and the like, and ultimately ended up purchasing 3 dump trucks in 1933. And they also ended up owning a restaurant, a barbershop, and a grocery store. So another person that worked on the railroad, Moses Roscoe, he actually left home at the age of 14, and he wandered through the South working on railroad crews throughout the South for about 50 cents a day. And then he ended up playing music in speakeasies and after-hour joints at night. But he ended up in York around 1938 and became a very well-known blues singer. And here in York, we have the Yorktown Hotel. And in 1927, William Myers became the head bell captain at the Yorktown. And he had served in that position for over 48 years. But he was quoted in an article stating that, restaurants and picture shows had been open to blacks until the Bamberg blacks came north. And that was very funny to hear. He said the first wave of blacks that came to help pave the streets and work at American Chain. And the funny thing is that we actually know for a fact that there was a Philadelphia contractor named Henry Barton in 1921 who actually had a work crew of blacks that had come from the South as part of the Great Migration, who actually ended up helping pave North George Street, which goes straight through York. And David Orr, talking about the Nimmons, he went back down south to meet his wife. She is one of 7 descendants that settled in York. Most of the Bambergers came from a family known as Isaac and Josephine Grayson Simmons. They had 14 children, 7 of which ultimately migrated up to York and ended up settling here. But as Mr. Myers was stating that, the workers, when they came to pave the road or when they came working on the railroad, they saw that York was a really good place to live. So some of them had stopped off in Washington, D.C., but enough came that York had to create, because schools were still segregated then, York had to create 2 segregated schools just to handle the influx of children that were now coming up from the South as part of the Great Migration, which ultimately was the Aquila Howard. We talked about him before, laying the wreath on Lincoln's train. He ended up having an elementary school, named after him, as well as James Smallwood had the Smallwood School. But that was basically, do we have another slide? So I wanted to put this up because this was symbolic. Langston Hughes had actually written a poem about a one-way ticket north for Blacks to be able to escape, once Jim Crow laws had started. And that was what was considered part of the second wave of the migration on the railroad up to the north. And the reasons were, lynchings had increased. There was a lynching, especially York, talking about the Bambergers in South Carolina. There was a lynching of Anthony Crawford, which basically caused a huge exodus up north. And they basically forced that huge exodus to definitely come north. And as I said, kicked off the wave for the, sorry, we have fire engines going off here, to kick off the north, the second wave of the Great Migration, again, using the railroad as part of that. So, constructions and railroads brought thousands of people, Blacks up for mining. So the southern West Virginia was open to mining, as well as here in Delta in southern York County, we had the slate mines, which my grandfather was ultimately killed in one of those. But that is pretty much my part and my understanding, my interpretation of how the railroad affected and had its part to play in African-American community here in York, not just so much York, but just to show how, from the beginning of the railroads, when the slave labor was used to build the actual railroad tracks, to, transitioning from those jobs into the general labor jobs, the brakemen and, the firemen and all those positions as hard labor jobs, which not only the men, but the women, ended up working on, just to, from that to the Underground Railroad. You go from getting your families torn apart using the railroad to having families reunited on the Underground Railroad and escape to freedom. And then just that whole transition from the hard labor jobs, but the Pullman Porters supplying that information, traveling around the country to their families back home, which showed them a better promise of a better life and opportunity up north, to bringing those families then north on the railroads, and also being part of them going back down to visit their families, bring more people north. And it still sort of, continues that way today. So any questions?
Okay, thank you, Tina. Excellent presentation. We'll watch as the questions comes in. Please place your questions in the comments section. And we've got a couple to get started with. Tina, you mentioned the Christiana Riots. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What that involved?
Well, I know that in Lancaster, there was a riot. It had to do with the Fugitive Slave Act. And from what I can remember, there was an uprising. There was an incident that happened, typical someone blaming a Black person for an incident that had happened against a white person. But also because of that, there was this huge riot in Christiana. I mean, it was really bad. And ultimately, a lot of the Black men that were involved in that had to flee and run away, basically to save their lives. So a lot of them made their way to York, across the bridge, because it wasn't too far from York. And that's the most that I can say about that right now.
All right. Okay, thank you. Mentioning the railroads are largely built by slaves and freedmen, and I guess the other, if you're wrong and assume the other group that was sort of had also great prejudice against it would have been the Irish. So what kind of upward mobility was there for these folks that were facing all this incredible prejudice against them? You mentioned some movement up to brakemen and so forth, but how often did that happen? What was the upward mobility like? Was there really an opportunity for them?
I believe more so up north, definitely from I know in Virginia, up through Maryland and, into Pennsylvania, there was more opportunity for the better jobs on the railroad. But the Southern Railroad, they basically got thrown in there after the Civil War. You had all of these displaced people, African Americans from, that were freed from slavery. And basically most would stay on, to do sharecropping. But I do believe that their children didn't see that as a lifelong commitment and wanted more. So this opportunity of rebuilding the railroads, because so many had been destroyed by the Civil War, to keep that transportation of goods going, it opened up a door for them to be able to at least go and help rebuild those. And by proving themselves able to handle the labor, they got those. As I said, the brakeman job back when it first started was the most dangerous job to be, able to separate those cars and put the brakes on, because there were no brakes for the train unless you got on top of the train and, turned that actual brake wheel to put the brakes on. So many men, had died falling off the trains, falling between the trains. But I do believe that, from the families that I've talked to, that have talked to their grandparents and everything, that, it definitely was a struggle. And even the Pullman Porters jobs, when they first started, weren't seen so much as like a glamorous job, to a point, because they were likened to, a house slave. They were, the racism was definitely there while they were performing that job. But for them, it was an opportunity to see the country, to see things they had never seen before, to go places they had never gone before, to bring these stories back. And the Pullman Porters actually created a middle class for the African Americans in the railroad industry.
Well, that's interesting. Speaking about classes, I know that after the Civil War, there was a lot of hobos on the railroads, as I suppose PTSD and so forth. So, was there some documentation of some of these African American folks headed north as hobos? Were they mostly paying their way, or was there some kings of the road traveling as hobos as well?
I'm sure. I'm sure there were hobos of all sorts. Hobos are always associated with the railroad, but as far as the Great Migration is concerned, like I said, there were actually, because of the shortage caused in labor from World War I, there was actually newspaper articles that I read, like for instance down in Bamberg, where the southern states were extremely upset by the Great Migration. They actually were even outlawing these agents that the companies were sending down south to recruit these people to hop on a train and come north. And, they were having huge meetings and all sorts of articles in the newspaper saying, because it was taking away their labor, and they were having a huge shortage when it came to their crops down there, because they didn't have as many people working for them in the fields with the crops and everything. And everybody, they literally were calling it like an exodus. We're losing all of our Negroes, and they were putting articles in the paper to try to dissuade them from going north on the train, saying that, the life expectancy of a Black person who goes north is like cut in half compared to down here, because you're not used to the cold weather, and, you're not used to all the diseases that are up north. And they literally were doing everything they could to try to keep them to stay down south. But, again, a lot of these companies, the boat yards, the shipyards, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, even, they were literally sending these articles down there saying, hey, come up here, it's better pay. And plus, you get free fare to hop on a train and come up. But like I said, a lot of people would actually hop off the train before they got there somewhere else. They were using it, to get, it was like a means to an end for them to be able to get north because they couldn't afford to really pay for the fares themselves anyway.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like treat people horribly and then be surprised that they leave, huh?
Pretty much.
Yeah. You mentioned William Goodridge. He's pretty famous, pretty well remembered, at least among local history buffs in the area. As I understand it, he was a fairly well-to-do guy as folks go at that time. How was it that he managed to get some of the escaped slaves out of York? What kind of means did he use to accomplish that?
Well, we know that he had his 13 cars on the rail cars that he had, but he had, like most Underground Railroad conductors, he had a hidden compartment in his basement of his house. So being part of that network for the Underground Railroad, when they would show up at his house, he would then, from what I understand, sneak them through the peach orchard that was behind his house to the railroad to put them on his car. And then they would usually go to his cars ran between York and Philadelphia. So he would then send them to William Still in Philadelphia. William Still was, a famous abolitionist and received the majority of, escaped slaves in Philadelphia. And but yeah, he was well-to-do. William Goodridge ended up, he owned a grocery store. He was very big into his wares that he sold and everything, and did get himself up to where he could purchase those cars. I believe he purchased them around 1840, 1842, somewhere in there, and then used those as, a means to help him in his involvement on the Underground Railroad.
Very good. We've got another question here from a viewer. What was the impact of Jim Crow cars on the trains?
Jim Crow cars. So there was still segregation. I'm not sure exactly what a Jim Crow car was.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the definition. Perhaps
Okay.
it was cars that African American people were prohibited from entering.
Yeah, I did see. So some friends and I, we got the opportunity to go down to the Smithsonian's African American Museum a couple years back. And one of the exhibits that they do have there is a segregated, I guess it would be called a Jim Crow car, where you could go in and literally see the difference in the services that they gave for, that white line, to say the bathroom was like, it was like so small that you could barely stand in it compared to the bathroom that was given to the white people. But yeah, that was the other problem. Even at the train stations were even segregated down south, where, they couldn't even sit in the same area to wait for the train to come. But yet, when they rode on the train, then they were also given segregated cars to ride in, or,
Sure.
They could not dine with, they had to eat in their cars. They were not allowed to go to the dining cars on the train or anything else like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I appreciate your presentation. It looks like that's all the questions we have. But thank you very much for everybody who tuned in tonight. And okay, we have another one coming in here saying, sorry, I came in late, but can you mention again about the migration to Delta, PA?
To Delta? Okay.
Yes, this was the question.
Okay, so there was a huge migration because we are so close to the Maryland line. A lot of people that, well, we know even previous to what's known as the Great Migration, but we've always had African Americans coming across into southern York County. And in the early, I'm going to say around the Civil War era up through to the 1900s, southern York County was predominantly Black. It was Black farmers everywhere until industrial jobs started showing up, then a lot of them actually came up to between York City and Wrightsville to the factory jobs. And that's when they all started selling off their farms, when farming wasn't as, lucrative for them anymore. And coming from like when, as I said, during the Great Migration, when they would take the train, a lot of people were going to Baltimore to get jobs in the shipyards and the like. But, there's also, we know the railroad was used. There used to be an amusement park in West York. And every year they said they had to actually add on cars. There would be a train of Black folk that would come up from Maryland specifically to go to this park. And they would come, they would have their own band and everything. So when they would get off on the train station, they would literally have like a mini parade all the way to the park. And it got to be to the point where the mayor finally had to tell them they were not allowed to do this parade any longer because it was disturbing to some of the folks that lived by. But they would come up and stay for the entire day and then go back down to Baltimore on the train. But into Delta, we actually have a couple, two that I know of, African-American cemeteries that are down there that we've, gone down and visited and worked with. And there were AME Zion churches down there as well. So I hope that answers part of that.
Well, thank you very much, Tina. This has really been enlightening. It's certainly a very different view, and it's nice to know a good bit about the role of the African Americans. Oh, looks like we got another question here. It's just a second here. Okay. Cloud Carriers Black Union will bring trainloads of families to York County for conferences and picnics. Looks like more of a comment or a little bit of information for us. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions we have, but this was certainly a very enlightening presentation. Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it, and you really helped to make Historic Railroad Week very special. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it tonight. I'm sorry we had some problems with the slides, but hopefully we made up for that in the end. And please don't forget to tune in again tomorrow night for Franklin County's iron furnaces and the railroads. And do have a very pleasant evening. Good night.
Thank you.